Hi guys, my name is Joe and welcome to Fighting Words, the martial arts library. On this channel I review martial arts books and talk about other martial arts related subjects. This is going to be something a little bit different. I'm going to be doing some Q&A. This is based partly on questions that some of my friends have asked me and partly on things that I have found on Facebook and other sources. So, hope you'll enjoy. Why all the excitement about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and not traditional Jiu-Jitsu, and what's the difference? Okay, this is going to be a long one. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu got popular largely because of the early UFCs in the 90s, initially, and then later in the 2000s, again because of the UFC. So, real quick. In the 90s, we had the UFC 1, and again the first several after that. And to the public, the idea is we're going to take representatives from multiple styles of martial arts, and we're going to put them in a single elimination tournament, and whoever wins has the best style. That's sort of how it was marketed. And Royce Gracie won 3 out of the first 4. He was a representative of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, known as Gracie Jiu-Jitsu at the time. As a quick aside, the reason that they use the term Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is because there was a legal dispute over copyright between family members. So they're like, well, if you're not going to let us call it Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, we're just going to call it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Also, there's more than one lineage of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. There's at least one other called the Fada lineage, named after Osvaldo Fada, I believe. That's where a lot of people initially heard of Gracie/Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So, you know, this guy who was outweighed by all of his opponents, significantly in some cases, wound up beating all of them using skill and technique. That was very appealing. In Japan, his brother Hickson was more or less doing the same thing, so even if you were starting to dig deeper, the Gracie name keeps popping up. And also in Japan, you had other members of the family. Hinzo was a figure in Pride FC for a while. In the 90s, that was what we got. Now, because of various government regulations and the fact that mixed martial arts was sort of an outlaw sport, that sort of went away for a while. But in 2005, it sort of hit the mainstream again thanks to the Ultimate Fighter reality show. And all these guys had various fighting backgrounds, but Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gets brought up again, mostly because these guys are bringing in trainers, or, their background happens to be in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And then when people start watching the fights, the play-by-play guy was Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan's background was in Taekwondo. Not a whole lot of MMA fighters had a Taekwondo background or were using it effectively, so he didn't talk about it that much. He's a tremendous fan of boxing. Allegedly, he's got this big collection. He knows a lot about the history of it. You don't really need boxing explained, especially at the rather low level of boxing that existed in mixed martial arts at the time. You don't need to explain to somebody that somebody swinging a punch at someone's head is going to cause a knockout. So, his other main background was in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And that needed someone to explain what was going on. Yeah, you see that guy? He's trying to get his leg over the other guy's shoulder so he can choke him with his legs. That's not something that most people will instinctively understand. So, every time people turned on the UFC, they were listening to Joe Rogan talk about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So once again, that got it in people's heads. It became part of the sort of pop culture lexicon. We see more of it in movie fights. We see people doing things like flying arm bars and, more Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu based moves in modern fight choreography. So more and more it enters the modern, pop culture zeitgeist. Another benefit of it is that many people from many different backgrounds can use it for something. So the guys who did want to get into mixed martial arts fighting, well, you need to train at least a little Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu so that you won't get caught in submissions. Or, hey, you liked wrestling in high school. Wasn't that fun? Well, you're 32 years old now. You're not in high school anymore. But Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is just like wrestling, except it has chokes. Women who are concerned about some very specific types of self-defense. Hey, a guy throws you down and gets on top of you. Wouldn't you like to know how to break his arm from that position? Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Law enforcement and security. Hey guys, would you like to know how to restrain someone without needing to punch them, which looks terrible on camera? Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So its popularity has been maintained by the fact that people looking for different things can sort of find it all in this. And also, it should be noted that there was a tremendous marketing campaign from the Gracies and their cousins, the Machados, and a lot of their students during the 90s and early 2000s. So that explains why in any major metropolitan city in the United States, you're going to find several Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schools. So why is it more popular than traditional Jiu-Jitsu? The thing is, traditional Jiu-Jitsu had the longest sustained popularity of any martial art, but it stopped about World War II. So, traditional Jiu-Jitsu / Judo, because they were the same thing for a period of time, that was the first East Asian art that really exploded in the West. That was the 1890s when, for instance, in England, we had a fellow named Barton Wright who brought over jiu-jitsu trainers. We had members of, the judo founder, Jigoro Kano, like people from his club were going out and sharing judo, or again, as it was known as at the time, Kano Jiu-Jitsu. The terms were sort of interchangeable for a while. I actually have a book from the early 20th century that says Jiu-Jitsu, also known as Judo, or something to that effect. The spread of Judo and traditional Jiu-Jitsu were simultaneous. Fast forward to World War II. Japan is defeated. The United States gets there and says, okay, you guys need to stop with this paramilitary culture that's everywhere, right? So nobody does any martial arts. There was a ban on martial arts in Japan for several years. When it came back, partly because of the demands of the West and partly because, the native population had sort of seen where that focus on militarism had gotten them, the focus turned from we're using these martial arts because they are effective to martial arts are a means of personal development. And everything became a do. Do means way. It became a way or a path for self-improvement. So Judo became the focus over Jiu-Jitsu. Jutsu means art or method. But it's, the Ju part of it means pliant or yielding, or it's often translated as gentle. So, all that to say that they were basically the same thing, kind of, sort of. I mean, there were multiple schools of Jiu-Jitsu. But after World War II, the focus was heavily on Judo. And even schools that continue to train Jiu-Jitsu would do Judo competitions. So it seems to me, based on some of the interviews I've read, based on some of the instructional books that I have, that Judo was the competitive wrestling side where, we're going to meet in the mat and we're going to grab each other's jackets and we're going to go for throws and pins. But the Jiu-Jitsu was taught alongside of it as sort of the self-defense, bone-breaking aspect. And again, you look at these early texts and there's an emphasis like, this is about using leverage to break a man's bone. Again, that sort of gets lost in the transition. And I also suspect that once Judo became an Olympic sport, which I think happened in the 60s, there was a greater burden to regulate the sport. So, if you wanted to compete in judo, now you needed to be associated with the Kodokan and the various international organizations that regulated judo. So if you trained a family style of jiu-jitsu, but then you also had your guys going out and doing judo competitions, well, now if you're not associated with the Kodokan, maybe you don't get to do judo competitions anymore. So at that point, the jiu-jitsu styles that were out there sort of began to fade into the background, and none of them had a single unifying organization to really bring them to the forefront. So you have, styles that are offshoots of the original Japanese styles. You have like Japanese family styles, but no unifying body for really any of these. There are a few out there, but they don't really unify globally all the jiu-jitsu schools. So what are the differences between them? There was a time where there wouldn't be much difference between what the Gracies were teaching and what you might find in another jiu-jitsu school that taught a quote-unquote traditional style. These days, in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the emphasis has been placed on the competitive side of Jiu-Jitsu. There are schools that still teach the self-defense stuff, but most schools will, most of the time, focus on preparing for the ground grappling heavy sport side of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Traditional Jiu-Jitsu schools can vary widely. I've seen some that can look like judo. I have seen some that incorporate a fair amount of striking and are almost like karate. Some are very traditional and will incorporate like traditional Japanese weapons like katana, the swords, or the kusari, the chains. So it's very difficult to know if you're training in a traditional jiu-jitsu style what you're actually going to get. So that might be one of the biggest differences between them, is the variety that you might get with traditional jiu-jitsu. Again, some may focus on a sporting aspect. Many focus on a self-defense aspect. I would say one of the things that seems to be common across traditional jiu-jitsu styles will be that there's sort of a question and answer approach to self-defense. So, the opponent comes in with an overhand strike and, you block it and stun him with a strike of your own and then throw him and finish him off. Where the opponent grabs your collar and, you defend against that and, again, hit him with your own move and finish it with a throw and a lock or a strike on the ground. So that seems to be a common theme across most of the traditional jiu-jitsu styles that I've seen. And I hope that answers your question. Where do martial arts fit in with today's culture? Anywhere you want. It sounds like a cop-out answer. Here's the thing. Unless you need to do martial arts as a profession, then ultimately you're going to do them for your enjoyment. And I know that, it's going to raise some hackles by people, like, martial arts is a way of life, and I totally dedicate myself. Like, okay, dude, but you're doing it because you like it. You're not doing it because you have to. The thing is, people get into martial arts for a number of different reasons. They can be practical, they can be not so practical. If you like doing cool moves, because I know people who've gotten into martial arts because I like doing cool moves, so I'm going to learn all these flippy and spitty kicks. Cool. If you get into martial arts to learn self-defense, go ahead and do that. If you get into it because you enjoy the competition, if you get into it because you enjoy, the embracing a different culture, or at least a little bit of that different culture, that's great. So on a wide view, that's where martial arts fit in to today's culture. On a narrower view, again, you have people that need to train specifically for careers in violence or careers that involve violence. So we're basically talking, professional fighter, professional trainer, people who are in security or law enforcement. Those are the ones that are going to have to train that. We can sort of contrast martial arts with, like, well, people today have guns and, that's the best self-defense. Like, I don't know, maybe it is if you're good at using a gun. There are definitely people who take the perspective that, martial arts have no place in self-defense in the real world today. Here's the thing. Violence can be chaotic and unpredictable. You might not get an opportunity to get to your firearm, or it might misfire, or you might drop it. You better know how to handle yourself. You better know how to throw some punches. You better know how to fight in the clinch, do some wrestling. That aspect hasn't been lost in the modern time. So, yeah, martial arts in today's culture. What do you think of this advice? The coach told us at the end of the class yesterday to specialize in submissions and try not to learn too many different ones. All right, again, that's from, my buddy that trains Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. With the practical side of all martial arts, you can't be equally good at everything, especially something that gets as in-depth and complicated as, well, I'd say any form of grappling, really. You can even see this in striking styles. Boxing, some would say, only has 4 punches, but boxers tend to specialize in making one of those their go-to punch. I think during the golden age of the heavyweights, Joe Frazier had a great left hook. Muhammad Ali and Sonny Liston were both known for their jab. It's not like they didn't know other punches, but that punch was what the rest of their game was built around. In the Japanese martial arts, I believe the term is tokoiwaza, which is basically your favorite techniques. So when my buddy was asking for advice, my go-to with that is, like, ultimately yes. Find out what submissions you're hitting the most and build the rest of your game to sort of funnel things toward that end goal. So, it doesn't matter what style of martial arts you do. I think that that's generally good advice. If you take a look at Ronda Rousey, I think that's a great example. It's not like she didn't know the full breadth of judo. What did she specialize in? Koshiguruma, which is that headlock throw. She'd get into a scarf hold position once the fight hit the mat, and then she'd work her way toward an armbar. It's not like she didn't have other throws. That was her go-to. If it failed, she'd typically go for a foot sweep. The lesson here is that figure out what your end goal is. What is your go-to move? Is it a side kick? How do I set up my side kick? Well, if I fake the round kick, maybe it'll set up the side kick. Is it, at Uchimata, maybe I fake this throw before I get my Uchimata. Figure out what your go-to is in, like, really specialize in it. Learn that move backwards and forwards. Then learn your setups. Learn what to do if your opponent stalls it out and, blocks off that particular avenue. Learn what your follow-ups are. Okay, I hit this move, but it didn't succeed 100%. Now that I'm in this position, what are the next steps that I take in order to keep winning? I think that this can even sort of apply to self-defense. If you have an end goal, like, what is my main objective from here? Is it like a flurry of strikes? Is it attaching? Okay, well, how do I get there? And what are my fail-safes if I can't get to that initial position in order to get me back there? So yeah, in general, I think that that's pretty good advice. What do we think of the Philly shell for street fighting? Okay, first of all, street fights are almost entirely avoidable, and there's like a terrible cost-benefit ratio to them. Don't do them. With that being said, if we are using this thought experiment, this came from one of the groups that I'm part of. Someone put up a video of the use of the Philly shell in boxing. From that perspective, here's the thing. It's a very specialized skill. I think most people who are good at the Philly shell are not going to have a problem with most untrained street fighters. But if we're looking at it in the totality of everything, one of the defenses against a same side hook, a lead left hook, works in boxing because you have, 10 to 18 ounce gloves on your hand, so you can catch it on this padded area here. If you are in a situation where you don't have that padding, I would suggest folding the forearm over and using the forearm to help sort of catch that impact. I think that the low lead hand position can be used to dig for underhooks or help block takedowns coming in. We've seen Robert Whitaker in mixed martial arts use it in that manner. Bill Superfoot Wallace in kickboxing use a similar position. So if we are including kicks in this, we at least have proof of concept that it can be used for that. You know, he would use more of a back fist as opposed to a jab from that position. So we have proof of concept that it can be used outside of the boxing environment. If that's what we're going to call a street fight, where we're worried about takedowns, where we're worried about kicks, I think all of those things can be used or can be prepared for and defended against there. Again, I wouldn't see it as a go-to, but those are some ideas that we can work with. I'm curious about why all these highly specific schools of martial arts developed, and MMA was so wildly novel so much later in history. Was no one ever a pragmatist? Really, this deserves its own incredibly well-researched long-form video. But I'm going to give it a shot sort of off the cuff. So, historically, martial arts have been divided into two camps. You've had those created for ritual combat or sport. Most of those have been various folk styles of wrestling. So some form of grappling, you know, the rules varied. You know, we got a belt that we're supposed to grab, or we have a jacket we're supposed to grab, or, you know, it only counts if you throw the guy on his back, or it counts if you can, you know, make him touch the ground with his hands or his knees. The rules varied, but it was still pretty much, you know, grab the guy and throw him, right? The other category would be what I'm going to refer to as combatives, and this was meant to supplement armed combat. I think this is where we get early forms of pugilism, and I mean pugilism across the board, not necessarily referring to like pre-Queensberry, you know, English boxing. But if you think about how soldiers were generally fighting, you had a shield, you had a sword. So you used your front hand to block or to push or to grab, and use your rear hand to attack, you know, with your sword or your axe or your spear or what have you. But that was, again, mostly confined to, here's how we fight with weapons, so let's try the same thing without weapons. In the past, and I mean the relatively recent past, there was still very much a pragmatic approach to martial arts. One of the problems was that the things that sort of grew out of the combatives didn't really have a safe pressure testing format. We're often sort of caught up in this idea that, well, they use it in real battle, so it must be effective. Like, or maybe it wasn't. You know, like, nobody won any wars with, like, spin kicks, right? People who had fought in battles took their training, and they would teach, you know, their family or, you know, their village. I know that there are many family and village styles in China and I think Southeast Asia, but these were no longer battlefield styles. You know, so we're learning like the hitting aspect to it, but we can't practice it in the way that we could practice boxing, basically. You know, let's throw things on our hands that aren't going to damage our hands or the other person's face if we practice hitting each other over and over, right? That didn't really exist. And I think largely because of that, systems that were not turned into sports, like we had in the West, you know, we did have pugilism, and there are various forms of sport pugilism, in India, on the African continent, just in a lot of different places where strikes were incorporated in addition to throws or just by themselves. I mean, Muay Thai in its current form evolved out of a kind of pugilistic sport where, guys had their hands wrapped up in, I think it was rope, and we see that sort of in that region of Southeast Asia. But in a lot of other places, it was like, I don't know, hit the guy really hard, maybe it'll make his heart explode, and we see in places like China, Korea, Japan, Okinawa, hand conditioning, hitting wall bags, hitting striking posts, the idea that we're trying to make our fists like iron. But again, it's difficult to develop offensive and defensive skills when you cannot spar. Fast forward a little bit, you did have certain competitions in the late 1800s, early 1900s. In China, you had Li Tai competitions. So these were on raised platform. Striking was allowed. I think some grappling was allowed, maybe in the form of throws. And you could win by throwing the guy off of the platform. These were generally considered pretty dangerous. In Japan, you had different jiu-jitsu schools challenging one another. And again, these were considered very dangerous. There was like no point system. You didn't win with a single throw. Guys were going out there until somebody quit. The formats that we had in the early 20th century for Eastern martial arts were very rare, very dangerous, and sort of looked down upon depending on your region. Fast forward to, after World War II. Karate went from a very close-in fighting system in Okinawa, where you grab the guy and you hit him, to being influenced by the ideas from Kendo. So now we're doing like long-distance fighting where all I have to do is touch you, because I can't hit you because that would be too deadly. China has gone through, a civil war, World War II, another civil war, and, the takeover of the communists, the Cultural Revolution, where they were like shunning all things old. In addition to like a lot of really authentic, legitimate martial arts being shut down, there was also an aspect of Chinese martial arts that were used for performance. So, you had the various opera companies where they were doing theatrical martial arts. You had street performers who were doing theatrical martial arts. And I think I strongly suspect this is maybe where we get in, some of like the animal styles or the drunken styles and things that on the surface don't look like real fighting. And probably some of the parlor tricks, you'll see guys like, holding their arm out and a guy will break a pole over their arm like, oh, and I'm not saying that doesn't require skill and discipline, but it's not the same thing as fighting. But a lot of people sort of think that even today. When things are coming over, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, we are not getting the martial arts as they were most martially practiced. And in addition, there are like elements of non-pragmatism to it. From Japan, after World War II, things are being trained as, cultural expressions or means of personal development. So it doesn't matter if this works in a fight, it matters if you can do it in a perfect way, because that will show your personal growth and development, right? So we're getting, talk about death touches and all that stuff is coming over. And of course there's, Orientalism going on and, the deadly mystic secrets of Tibet or whatever, right? So all that floods the West when it comes over, to varying degrees. There were always like legitimately tough people. There were always people who were teaching martial arts as a practical method of fighting. But a lot of the other stuff came over too, and, there were people who were attracted to that. So at that point, again, there are still certain pockets of pragmatism. Judo was a very specialized form of fighting, but it was still fighting. Like a judo person, if they grabbed you, was going to throw you, and could choke you and break your arm and all that. In karate, you had pockets of people training full contact. Kyokushin eventually came out. It wasn't quite as popular as some of the non full contact styles, but luckily, in the West, we had people that began to train that stuff full contact, and that's how we got American kickboxing. And of course, uh, you had the Kyokushin guys transitioning into kickboxing a bit and bringing that over to Holland, and really beginning like the Dutch kickboxing scene. So all this stuff sort of stayed around. In like the late 80s slash early 90s, you had shoot fighting, which was pro wrestlers who wanted to fight for real. So yes, by the time the UFC came around, it was rare to have full contact challenge matches, but there was always something like that around. Now, I think what mixed martial arts really did was it was the most open format that was available. So, especially back in the early like Vale Tudo and No Holds Barred days, no biting and no gouging. Even if you do it, we're just gonna like take some of your prize money away. We're not gonna disqualify you. So, we got people who would throw headbutts and, people who would attack the groin, and, such an open format. And eventually it did become more sportified. As a quick aside, Shuto had a very sportified version of it, in the late 80s. If you were a wrestler, you could transition into mixed martial arts. If you did Taekwondo, you could transition into mixed martial arts. If you did kickboxing, you could transition into mixed martial arts. There was an opportunity for you to participate in this environment no matter what your background was. If you were a wrestler, you were probably not going to do kickboxing. If you were a boxer, you were probably not going to try your hand at something that, focused on grappling, right? So here's a format where you can do both. And I do think that we've seen how these different sides have sort of blended together. Guys are using, kickboxing to set up takedowns. They're using wrestling and, jiu-jitsu, positional stuff to pin the guy on the ground, and then use striking to, lay in some ground and pound. So all this stuff is coming together. I think it's beautiful. I don't think it's the be-all, end-all, but it's a really great format for what it is. Pragmatism always existed. There are always going to be people who are okay doing their own things that are not pragmatic. You don't have to be focused on pragmatism to be involved in martial arts. People train for a number of different reasons. Some people train because they want to get more in touch with a certain culture as part of their heritage, perhaps. Some people like to do it as a form of exercise. I think it's best when people are self-aware enough. There's one guy that I encountered on a forum years ago. It's like, I do Shotokan because I like Shotokan. Those Muay Thai guys can beat me up. I got no problem admitting that, but I like Shotokan, so I'm going to stick with Shotokan because my goal isn't to be the best beater-upper. Martial arts isn't always about pragmatism, but there have been pockets that have focused on pragmatism throughout history. I hope that answers your question. What's a realistic time frame for a character trained solidly in a style to pick up a different one? Now, this is from a friend of mine who does some writing. She's thinking in terms of characters. This can also sort of be applied to people. Here's the thing. I think if you train martial arts that are very different from another, you can train them concurrently. So, for instance, you can train something like Greco-Roman wrestling and Arnis, which has a focus on stick and knife fighting. Because those things are not going to really interfere with one another that much. I think training two very similar striking styles can be a problem if you begin them both at the same time, or you don't have a whole lot of experience in one or the other. Tang Sudo versus Shotokan. Because even the forms are very similar, but there's enough differences that, if you do the Tang Sudo version in your Shotokan class, your Shotokan teacher is going to tell you it isn't right. I don't think you need to necessarily stick with one thing as long as what you're training is different enough from each other. With that being said, I think 3 years of training, 4 to 5 hours a week, 3 to 5 hours, let's be a little generous. If you do that for 3 years on a pretty consistent basis, you should be competent enough to introduce something else without really splitting your focus. That doesn't necessarily make you like expert level, but it does make you competent. So I hope this answers that question. What is the best half guard for self-defense? All right, this one comes from a friend of mine whose primary art is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but he wants something that's just as useful for competition and for self-defense. And there are definitely things in that category. The two that I suggested to him, the first one was what's called knee shield guard, where, and there are some variations, but the version I recommend is a high knee shield where you basically, okay, half guard, you have one of your opponent's legs trapped between yours, you are on the bottom. In the knee shield variation, you brace your knee and shin against your opponent's upper body. This makes it much more difficult for them to get toward you with punches. You can use some of your more powerful extensor muscles in order to push them away. You can create space and get back to your feet. The only issue I see with this is that the arm that's on the outside of the leg, you're going to have to control that with your hand. If it has a bladed or stabby weapon, they might be able to, do significant damage to like your hips and your thigh while you're in that position if you're only relying on your legs to defend yourself. So, grip control. Always go for grip control. The other variation that I recommended is half butterfly. This is a variation of full butterfly, which is one of my go-to positions. I like butterfly guard because you can push your opponent away, or you can kick them over. You upset their center of gravity. That's entirely what that position is for. And in half butterfly, you have one of your insteps under one of their thighs. I have a photo up here. And you can use that, again, to disrupt their center of gravity. It makes it very difficult for them to attack. You can off-balance them and throw them off of you. And it does allow for greater ease in controlling and clinching the upper body. So, punches need room. Punches need a certain amount of room in order to work. If you're basically, tying up the guy's upper body, you're getting into a chest-to-chest position. Any strikes that come in are going to have almost zero power on them at all. So those were the two that I recommended to my friend. How important is the ground game in real fighting? First of all, we need to define real fighting. I'm going to assume by the nature of the question that we're talking about an uncontrolled environment. So something that isn't a competition with a regulating body and all that. For self-defense and fighting are related but different. For self-defense, I would sort of relate it to first aid. Like, it's good to know. You probably won't need it, but you're definitely going to want to have it if you do. I think that there should be good education on ground escapes and reversals if one is interested in self-defense. To that end, from what I've seen, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the martial art that does the best job at this. And I've seen some training environments where they will also introduce non-sporting elements, like, what if I'm trying to escape at the same time I'm trying to access my firearm, or try to keep the other guy from, grabbing my firearm as I'm trying to escape from a pin. I think if you are not a law enforcement or security professional, that's about the extent that you need. I think that it is a good idea to have the ability to pin someone and restrain them on the ground. But again, for most civilians, that's not as necessary a skill as I need to get out of here, I need to get out of here. As a quick aside, I think anyone interested in real world self defense should spend 6 months in boxing and a year in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu at minimum. My reason for that is that after 6 months, you're going to be pretty comfortable seeing punches coming at you. These are all defensive. You're going to be comfortable seeing punches come at you. You're also probably going to be more defensively sound as you're throwing your own strikes, not letting your hands come away from your face as you're throwing, compared to someone who doesn't have that sort of training. And when it comes to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, you might learn some unusual and sport specific moves in class, but when it comes time to do the rolling or sparring, if you're a newbie, you're going to spend most of your time getting crushed by people who are more experienced, and most of your time learning how not to panic as you're trying to escape a pin or a choke, or preventing someone from going for an arm lock by controlling your arm. So you're going to get good at responding to someone controlling your limbs. And again, after about a year of that training, an untrained person is probably not going to be able to hold you in a pin. So yeah, that's my go-to. What do we think of capoeira for self-defense? I like capoeira a lot in the little bit that I've done. I think it's great for fitness. I think it tends to be a very jovial and laid-back environment. As far as requirements for self-defense go, and I say this with the caveat that there are some schools that I think specialize in self-defense from what I've seen, and historically there have been simpler moves from capoeira like headbutts and open hand strikes. But what most people are going to be training in most environments will not transition to a self-defense scenario as well as a lot of other things. So to that end, I'm not saying don't do capoeira. I wouldn't make it your number one or number two or number three choice for self-defense. But it is going to get you in great shape. It's going to improve things like agility and cardio and balance. All those things are valuable in a physical confrontation. But it's just very difficult for me to see sort of one of capoeira's signature kicks, like a meia lua de compasso, where that's your best option over something like a punch or a palm strike or a headbutt. How were students ranked before the craze over belts got to be a thing? Okay. First of all, a little bit of history. Belt rankings basically come from judo. So we're tracing it back to Japanese martial arts. Started in judo, spread to many other contemporary Japanese martial arts, those coming along in the early 20th century. And those spread to the Korean martial arts because, for instance, Taekwondo and Tang Soo Do have some of their roots in Japanese karate. Hapkido has some of its roots in Daito-ryu Akijutsu, which is another Japanese style. So bearing in mind that that's where things were in Japan, and it did sort of spread to other places. I've seen, I think, some Filipino martial arts adopt a belt ranking system. Savate, which is a French kickboxing art, basically, they don't use a belt ranking system, they use a colored gloves system, but I think we can trace that back to the idea of colored belt ranks. What did they do before that? In Japan, you had Menkyo Kaiden, which was basically a certificate that said that you understood the art. I'm not an expert in this area. This is my understanding of it. Again, any corrections I'm going to put on the screen here somewhere. But yeah, if you were going to become the successor of an art, you got awarded a Menkyo Kaiden. You got a scroll or a certificate that said, you're the guy. I know in the Chinese martial arts, there was a hierarchical structure. It wasn't determined by like a belt rank or a specific designation other than, this guy is your older brother. This, they use terms like that, older and younger brother. And basically, if the guy started like an hour before you, he's your senior. If he started an hour after you, he's your junior. And there was that striation of ranks. So that sort of existed in that environment. So those are the things I know about martial arts ranks before belts. Anyway, that's all I have for this week, and I hope you guys have enjoyed this, and I'll see you around.